The bread had gone 3 days ago, not the stale, crumbling kind that tasted of sawdust and resignation, but the last real piece, a heel of dark rye that she had been rationing into slivers so thin she could see her own fingers through them. Now there was nothing. Just the gnawing below her ribs that had stopped feeling like hunger and started feeling like a fist opening and closing inside her, slow and deliberate, as though her own body was trying to grip something that was no longer there. Elara knelt in the mud outside the war tent of the Alpha King, and the mud was not the clean kind. It smelled of horse urine and trampled grass, and the copper tang of old blood that had seeped into the earth from the field hospital 30 yards east. Her knees had sunk deep enough that the cold pressed through her wool skirt and into bone. She could feel each individual stone beneath the mud pressing into her kneecaps like knuckles. 7 days. She had been here 7 days. The guards had stopped acknowledging her on day 2. By day 4, they had begun stepping over her legs when they changed shifts the way you step over a fallen branch. Not cruelty, exactly. Indifference. The kind that is worse because it does not even bother to notice you are suffering. She had come from the Ashvale pack, though calling it her pack was generous. The Ashvale wolves had tolerated her the way a body tolerates a splinter, with low-grade inflammation and occasional sharp pain. Elara had no wolf. That was the simplest way to say it, though the truth was more complicated, tangled up in things she did not fully understand herself. She had been born during the blood eclipse, which should have meant power, should have meant a wolf so strong it howled before the child drew its first breath. Instead, silence. No shift at 13, no shift at 16, no shift at 20. The pack's healer had pressed cold hands to her temples and shaken his head and said the word dormant in a tone that meant dead. So she had become what wolfless women become in border packs during wartime. A ration clerk. She counted bags of grain and salted meat and dried apples, cataloguing supplies in a leather-bound ledger with a stub of pencil that she sharpened with a paring knife every evening. She was good at it. Meticulous. She could tell you exactly how many calories remained in the Ashvale stores at any given moment, down to the last jar of pickled beets, which is how she had discovered the theft. Beta Harlan had been siphoning supplies for months, not dramatically, not in ways that would trigger alarm. A bag of flour here, a crate of salt pork there, small enough to blame on miscounts or spoilage. But Elara's ledger did not miscount. Her columns added up with the precision of a woman who had nothing else to take pride in. And when she had brought the discrepancy to the pack's alpha old Fenwick, with his rheumy eyes and tobacco-stained beard, he had looked at her numbers, looked at Harlan standing behind her with his arms crossed and chosen. Not her. The beating had not been the worst part. Harlan's enforcers had been efficient about it. 3 cracked ribs, a split lip, bruises along her arms shaped like fingerprints. She had curled on the floor of the supply shed and listened to them walk away, their boots crunching on gravel, and one of them had laughed at something. The other said, already moved on, already forgetting. The worst part was the next morning, when Fenwick's mate, a silver-haired woman named Constance, who had once shown Elara how to darn socks with a proper whip stitch, walked past the supply shed without stopping, without even glancing at the door. Elara had heard her humming, a hymn, something about mercy. So Elara had done the only thing left to a wolfless Omega, with cracked ribs and a ledger full of proof. She had walked 40 miles through the borderlands, through territory contested between 3 packs, and the Alpha King's advancing army sleeping in culverts and beneath the roots of upturned oaks, eating whatever she could find. Dandelion greens that were mostly bitter stem, a handful of walnuts with shells so hard she cracked them with a rock and cut her palm on the fragments. Once a dead rabbit she found near the road that was fresh enough to cook over a small fire, though the meat was stringy and tasted of nothing. She had walked until she reached the war camp of Alpha King Kyle Blackthorn, whose army had been laying siege to the Eastern Territories for 6 months, whose name was spoken in the borderlands the way you speak about storms, not with hatred exactly, with the understanding that forces of nature do not care about your opinion of them. She had walked up to the first perimeter guard, held out her ledger, and said she had information about supply lines in the Ashvale territory. They had laughed. Not all of them. The youngest guard, a boy with the ghost of acne scars along his jaw, had at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. But the sergeant, a thick-necked wolf with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, had taken one look at her, at the mud-caked skirt and the bruises yellowing on her arms, and the way she held herself carefully around the ribs, and had said, "The Alpha King does not take audiences with strays." She could have left. She should have left. A smarter woman, a woman with a wolf and options, and someone waiting for her somewhere, would have turned around and disappeared into the tree line and found some other way to survive. But Elara had nowhere to go, and she had spent 23 years being invisible, and she had discovered something strange in the walking something that had crystallized during those 40 miles like salt forming on a rope left in brine. She was tired, not the tired that sleep fixes, the tired that comes from a lifetime of making yourself small enough to be tolerated. And she had decided somewhere between the culvert and the dead rabbit that if she was going to disappear, she would do it on her own terms. Kneeling in the mud outside the tent of the most powerful alpha on the continent, holding a ledger full of numbers that could save his supply lines 3 weeks of maneuvering. So she knelt. Day 1 it rained. A cold, horizontal rain that came off the mountains and found every gap in her clothing. She had no cloak. Her wool skirt absorbed water until it weighed twice what it should, pulling at her hips like hands, dragging her down. She shivered so hard her teeth made a clicking sound that she could hear inside her own skull. The guards changed shifts twice, and neither pair acknowledged her. Day 2. A camp follower, a washerwoman with red knuckles and a practical face, left a tin cup of water near Elara's knee without saying a word. Just set it down and walked away. Elara drank it in 3 swallows, and the taste of tin mixed with water was the sweetest thing she had ever known. Day 3, Beta Harlan's riders arrived at the camp. She saw them from where she knelt. 3 wolves on horseback, wearing Ashvale colors, riding through the camp's main corridor, with the easy arrogance of men who believe borders or suggestions. She recognized the lead rider, Declan Harlan's youngest enforcer, the one who had held her arms behind her back, while the other 2 worked on her ribs. He did not see her. Or if he did not recognize the mud-streaked woman kneeling in the thoroughfare as the ration clerk he had beaten in a supply shed 6 days ago. He rode past close enough that his horse's flank brushed the air near her face, and she smelled leather and sweat and the particular musk of Ashvale wolves like pine pitch and something sour underneath. Her hands tightened on the ledger. Therefore the camp doctor, a lean grey wolf with spectacles and ink-stained fingers, paused on his way to the field hospital and looked at her. Really looked. He crouched down and studied her face and said, "How long since you have eaten?" 2 days, she said, though it was closer to 3. He pressed his lips together and said, "You should leave." He does not see petitioners. He does not see anyone who is not a ranking wolf or a war council member. You will die here, and they will move your body, and that will be the end of it. She looked at him and said nothing. He stood and adjusted his spectacles and walked away. At the entrance to the field hospital, he paused and looked back at her over his shoulder, and something crossed his face that she could not read. Then he was gone. Day 5, her body began to eat itself. She could feel it. The cramps had shifted from her stomach to her muscles, a deep ache in her thighs and calves, and the long muscles along her spine. Her vision went strange at the edges, hazing to silver when she turned her head too fast. She stopped being cold, which she knew from her supply work was not a good sign. When the body stops registering cold, it means the body has begun to surrender. That night she heard wolves howling from the tree line. Not the organized calls of sentries or scouts. Wild wolves, actual wolves, not shifters. They sang in a minor key that seemed to vibrate in her sternum, and she found herself swaying to it. And for a moment something stirred deep in her chest, deep beneath the hunger and the cracked ribs and the 23 years of silence. Something that was not quite a sound and not quite a feeling, like a door being tested from the other side. She pressed her hand to her breastbone and held her breath. The sensation faded. The wolves stopped singing. The camp settled into the uneasy quiet of a military encampment at night, punctuated by the snap of canvas in the wind and the distant murmur of sentries. Day 6, she stopped being able to feel her fingers. The ledger slipped from her hands twice, and she picked it up each time with the slow deliberation of someone whose fine motor control has begun to erode. She could smell everything now with a sharpness that disoriented her. The wood smoke from the cook fires layered with rendered fat and scorched oats, the mineral tang of the nearby creek, the musk of dozens of wolves packed into close quarters, each with their own signature, and beneath it all something else. Something she could not name. A scent that was coming from the direction of the war tent, bleeding through the heavy canvas flaps, reaching her nostrils like a tendril of warmth in a cold room. Cedar, smoke, iron, and underneath, like a bass note, something almost sweet, like honey that had been heated until it went dark. She closed her eyes and breathed it in, and the thing in her chest stirred again. Harder this time. Insistent. Day 7, the tent flap opened. She did not see him at first. The morning sun was behind the tent, casting everything in front of it into silhouette, and all she registered was size. He was enormous, not in the exaggerated way of fairy tales, but in the way of a man who had been built for war, and then had war carved into him until there was nothing superfluous left. Broad through the shoulders, long-armed, he moved with the contained economy of a predator who does not need to hurry because nothing outruns him. Then the light shifted as he stepped forward, and she saw his face, and her heart did something it had never done before. It stopped, not metaphorically. She felt the pause, the skip, the sickening lurch, and then it restarted at twice the speed, hammering against her sternum, hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. Alpha King Cale Blackthorn had a face like a weathered cliff, a strong jaw shadowed with several days of beard, dark hair cropped close at the sides, and longer on top pushed back from a forehead, marked by a scar that ran from his left temple to just above his ear. His eyes were the color of raw amber, the kind with insects trapped inside, and they were looking directly at her. He had been mid-sentence. She caught the tail end of it, something about supply routes, and the Eastern Bridge spoken to someone behind him in a low voice that resonated in a register she felt in her diaphragm more than heard with her ears. Then he stopped, mid-word, the way an animal stops when it scents something unexpected. His nostrils flared. She watched it happen, the slight widening of his eyes, the way his body went utterly still, a stillness so complete it seemed to pull the air tight around him. His hand, which had been resting on the canvas tent flap, closed into a fist, the leather of his glove creaking. For 3 seconds he said nothing. The camp moved around them. Horses stamped. A blacksmith's hammer rang from the forge. Somewhere, a soldier was singing a bawdy song about a miller's daughter, and none of it mattered, because the Alpha King was looking at her the way a man looks at a hallucination he is not sure he wants to trust. Then he turned to the guard nearest the tent entrance. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that is more frightening than shouting. "How long has she been here?" It was not a question. It was a demand shaped like a sentence. The guard, a veteran wolf with 20 years of service, and a face that had seen 3 wars, went pale. 7 days, my king. She arrived 7 days ago, claiming to have information about the Ashval supply. 7 days. The words fell like stones into still water. Ilara watched the ripples spread. The second guard shifted his weight. A passing aide stopped walking. Even the blacksmith's hammer seemed to falter for a beat. Kyle Blackthorne descended the 3 wooden steps from his tent entrance, each step deliberate. His eyes never left her. As he came closer, the scent hit her full force, that cedar and smoke and dark honey, and the thing in her chest was no longer stirring. It was slamming, throwing itself against the inside of her ribs like a trapped animal, and she gasped, an involuntary sound, thin and sharp. He stopped 2 feet from where she knelt. Up close, she could see the amber of his eyes was not uniform. There were darker threads running through it like fractures in stone. His wolf was in those eyes. She could see it looking out at her. And it was not calm. It was barely leashed. When he spoke, his voice had changed, rougher, lower, as though something in his throat was interfering with human speech. "Who did this to you?" She blinked. The world was doing the silver edging thing again, her vision narrowing and expanding, and she was not sure if it was the hunger or the proximity of him, or the thing in her chest that would not stop hammering. "I have information," she said. Her voice came out cracked and hoarse. She had not spoken in 2 days. "About the Ashvale supply lines. Beta Harlan has been diverting. Who did this to you?" Each word separated by a breath. He was looking at her bruises now, the fading yellow on her arms, the split lip that had scabbed over but still pulled when she spoke. His jaw was clenched so tight she could see the muscle working beneath the skin, a small rhythmic flex that spoke of violence being actively contained. She opened her mouth to answer, and the world tilted. She felt herself going sideways the way a tree goes when the roots finally give, not fast, not dramatic, just a slow, inevitable lean. The ground came up to meet her shoulder, and the last thing she registered before the dark took her was his hands, both of them, catching her before she hit the mud. They were warm, impossibly warm, like he was running a fever that had nothing to do with illness. And the thing in her chest howled. She woke in warmth. Not the thin, contested warmth of a blanket stretched too far, but the dense, encompassing warmth of a space that had been made warm on purpose. She was lying on fur. She registered this first, because her body, after 7 days of cold mud and wet wool, responded to the sensation with something close to disbelief. The fur was thick and dark and smelled of cedar. His scent. She was lying in his scent. Her eyes opened onto the interior of the war tent, not the austere military quarters she had imagined. The tent was large, divided by canvas partitions into sections, and this section held a campaign bed, a small iron stove that radiated heat, a folding desk covered in maps, and a wooden chest with iron fittings. A lantern hung from the center pole, casting warm amber light. She was on the campaign bed. Someone had removed her boots and wrapped her in a fur-lined blanket. There was a cup of broth on the overturned crate, serving as a nightstand, still steaming. The smell hit her stomach like a fist, and she lurched upright, reaching for it, before conscious thought caught up with reflex. "Easy." The voice came from the corner. Cale Blackthorne sat in a camp chair, legs extended, arms crossed. He had removed his leather gloves, and his forearms were bare, corded with muscle and marked with scars. Some were old and white. Some were newer, still pink. He was watching her with an expression she could not decode. Not the cold authority she had expected. Something more unsettled. Like a man confronting a problem he had not anticipated. "Drink it slowly," he said. "If you take it too fast after a 7-day fast, your body will reject it." She looked at the broth. She looked at him. She looked at the broth again. She drank it slowly. It was bone broth, rich and salted with flecks of fat floating on the surface that caught the lantern light. Each swallow was a revelation. She could feel it traveling down, warm and substantial, filling the hollow space that had been empty so long it had begun to feel permanent. He watched her drink every drop and said nothing until she set the cup down. "Now," he said, "you will tell me who hurt you, and then you will tell me why you knelt in the mud outside my tent for 7 days instead of coming to the field hospital or the refugee station or any of the dozen places in this camp where someone would have fed you." She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. The broth had given her a steadiness she had not felt in days. Her thoughts were still slow, but they were her own again, no longer blurred by hunger into something animal and desperate. "I tried the proper channels," she said. "Your sergeant turned me away. I had information and no rank and no wolf. Those are 3 reasons to be ignored in a war camp." Something shifted in his expression. A flicker. The muscle in his jaw again. "You have no wolf." It was not a question either, but this one landed differently. She could hear the dissonance in his voice, the confusion, because he was an alpha, and alphas could sense wolves the way a compass senses north, and she knew what he was smelling on her, what his wolf was telling him, that there was something there, something beneath the surface, something that did not match the diagnosis of dormant, or the label of wolfless, or the 23 years of silence. "No," she said. "I have no wolf." He stared at her for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on knees, and said in that low, resonant voice, "My wolf is trying to tear out of my skin right now. He has been since the moment I stepped out of this tent and caught your scent on the wind. I have fought in 9 campaigns. I have killed 3 rival alphas in single combat. I have held a territory of 40,000 wolves together through a civil war, and right now, in this moment, the only thing I can think about is the fact that someone put bruises on your arms, and I do not yet know their name." She felt the blood rush to her face, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. He straightened. His eyes held hers. "You are my mate," he said. Simply. Not a declaration of triumph or possession. A statement of fact spoken with the gravity of a man who understands the weight of what he is saying. "And I need you to understand that everything about your life is about to change, starting with you eating actual food and telling me who I need to kill." She almost laughed, the absurdity of it. 7 days of kneeling in mud, and the Alpha King of the Eastern Territories was sitting in a camp chair, telling her she was his mate while she clutched an empty cup of broth and tried not to cry. "My name is Elara," she said. "I was a ration clerk in the Ashvale pack, and I do not need you to kill anyone. I need you to look at this ledger." She reached for it. It was on the crate next to where the broth had been. Someone had placed it there carefully, the way you place something you know matters to its owner. She held it out, and he took it, and she watched his eyes move over the first page of columns. He was quiet for a long time. His index finger traced a line of numbers, stopped, went back, traced again. "This is good work," he said. "I know." The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. He turned the page, and the next, and the next. His expression changed as he read, shifting from reluctant respect to something sharper. He was seeing what she had seen. The pattern, the siphoning, the careful, methodical way Beta Harlan had been bleeding Ashvale dry while the Pax Alpha looked the other way, because confronting it would mean confronting a wolf stronger than himself. "This is not just theft," Kyle said. "He is stockpiling. These quantities—" He looked up. "He is building a supply cache independent of the pack stores. Either he is planning to seize control of Ashvale, or he is selling to a third party." Elara nodded. "The third party. I found shipping manifests hidden beneath the false bottom of a grain crate. They reference a buyer in the Northern Territories. I could not bring the manifests. They were too bulky to carry. But the coordinates are in the margin notes on page 47. He flipped to page 47. Read the margin notes. When he looked up at her again, the expression was different. Not just respect. Something hungrier. Something that had nothing to do with supply lines, and everything to do with the scent that was filling the small space between them. Cedar meeting, something that was hers, something she had not known she carried until now. Lavender, rain-wet stone, the green of new growth. She could smell herself the way he must be smelling her, and it was disorienting. She had never smelled like anything to herself before. She had been scentless, another marker of her wolflessness, another absence to catalogue alongside the silence and the inability to shift. "You will stay," he said. It was not a question. She should have argued. She should have insisted on terms, on conditions, on some framework that preserved her dignity and independence. But she was 23, and she had nowhere to go, and the broth was warm in her stomach, and the fur was soft beneath her. And for the first time in her life, someone was looking at her as though she mattered. Not despite her lack of wolf. Not because of what she could provide. Just mattered. "I will stay," she said, "but I am not staying as your mate. I am staying as your intelligence asset. You want what is in this ledger. You keep me alive and fed and give me a place to work. That is the arrangement." He considered this. His amber eyes tracked across her face with the deliberation of a man reading a treaty. "For now," he said. For now, she agreed. And they both knew it was a lie. The first week in the Alpha King's camp was an exercise in contradictions. Elara had been given quarters adjacent to the war tent, a small canvas room that had previously served as a record storage space. It still smelled of old paper and the waxy residue of sealing stamps, and she found this comforting in a way she could not explain. A desk had been installed along with a cot, a wash basin, and a trunk of clothing that was not hers but fit her reasonably well. Someone had thought about this, had noticed her size and made calculations. She did not ask who. She suspected she knew. Her days took on a rhythm. She rose early before the camp stirred and washed with the cold water from the basin and dressed in the clean, practical clothes from the trunk. Wool trousers that tucked into boots, a linen shirt, a leather vest that she suspected had been cut down from a man's garment. She braided her hair a dark brown that caught reddish tones in the lantern light and pinned it up with a wooden clasp she had carried since Ashvale, her mother's. one of the only things. Then she worked. The ledger was the foundation, but Kyle had given her access to the camp's full supply records, and the story they told was troubling. 3 other border packs showed the same patterns as Ashvale. Small discrepancies, careful siphoning, the same third-party coordinates appearing in coded shorthand that she had learned to recognize. She built a map on the canvas wall of her quarters. Charcoal lines connecting packs, supply routes, flow patterns. She borrowed colored thread from the camp's seamstress and used it to mark different types of goods. Red for weapons, blue for food, yellow for medicine. The map grew until it looked like a nervous system, and standing in front of it, she could see the shape of something larger than one corrupt beta, a network, organized, deliberate, feeding supplies to an unknown buyer in the north. She presented her findings to the War Council on the 3rd day. The council met in the main section of the war tent around a table made of planks laid over sawhorses, and the men around it were the largest wolves Elara had ever seen. Kyle's inner circle. His beta, a massive, red-haired wolf named Torin, with hands like shovels, and a surprisingly gentle voice. His gamma, a dark-skinned woman named Sable, who wore throwing knives on a bandolier across her chest, and who had looked at Elara with open curiosity when she walked in. 2 senior commanders whose names she learned later. And Kyle, at the head of the table, watching her. She had expected resistance, a wolfless Omega woman presenting intelligence to a room of warrior wolves. She had prepared for it, had armored herself with data, and Precision had rehearsed her delivery until it was clean and direct and left no room for dismissal. Torin listened with his head tilted, the way a dog listens to a sound it cannot place. When she finished, he looked at Kyle and said, "Where did you find her?" "She was kneeling in the mud outside my tent for a week," Kyle said. "She found me." Sable laughed, a bright, sharp sound. "I like her," she said, "and her map is better than anything our scouts have produced in 6 months." She looked at Elara with eyes that were almost black. How did a ration clerk learn to do intelligence analysis? "Counting is counting," Elara said. "Whether you are counting bags of flour or troop movements, the numbers tell you what people are trying to hide." Sable's eyebrows rose. She looked at Kyle again. Definitely keep her. But not everyone was welcoming. On the 5th day, Declan of Ashvale requested an audience with the Alpha King. Elara learned this from the camp's communication log, which she had been given access to as part of her intelligence work. The request was formal, polite. It referenced a matter of pack governance regarding a missing member. She was standing in front of her map when the tent flap opened and Kyle filled the doorway. He had to duck to enter. The space felt immediately smaller. "Ashvale wants you back," he said. Elara kept her eyes on the map. She adjusted a thread that had come loose from its pin. Her hands were steady, but her heart was doing the fast skip thing again, the one that happened whenever he was within 10 feet. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "I told them to wait," he said. "I wanted to talk to you first." She turned to face him. He was leaning against the tent pole, arms crossed, filling the space the way weather fills a room. His presence was not just physical, it was gravitational. She could feel it pulling at her, a warmth along her skin that had nothing to do with temperature. "I am not going back," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are not. But I need to know what I am walking into. If I refuse to return you, Ashvale will take it as an act of aggression. They are a border pack under my territorial authority. I have the right to refuse, but not without consequence. Consequence for you or for me, for both of us." She folded her arms, mimicking his posture without intending to. "Then do not refuse," she said. Tell them I am here under a work contract. Intelligence analysis for the war effort. It is technically true, and it gives them a face-saving excuse not to push. He studied her. The amber eyes tracked and tracked. You think like a strategist, he said. I think like a woman who has spent her life reading rooms to survive them. Something in his expression changed, softened in a way that the hardness of his features should not have allowed. He pushed off the tent pole and crossed the small space and stood close enough that she could count the individual scars on his forearms, close enough that the cedar smoke honey scent wrapped around her like a blanket. Ilara. Her name in his voice was a physical thing. It pressed against her skin like warm water. I cannot keep pretending. This is a business arrangement, he said. My wolf is going to tear me apart. Every night I lie in that bed, 30 feet from where you are sleeping, and he howls. He howls for you. I have never. He stopped, corrected himself. I was not built for patience, Ilara. I was built for war and territory and taking what is mine. And every part of me is telling me that you are mine. She swallowed. The thing in her chest, the thing that stirred and slammed and howled, was doing all three at once. But there was fear tangled up in it. Not fear of him. Fear of herself. Of what she might become if she let this in. Of what might happen when the bond fully formed and she had nothing to offer in return. No wolf, no pack standing, no power, just a woman with a ledger and a map, and 23 years of being nothing special. I am not ready, she whispered. He closed his eyes, drew a breath that she felt against her face, warm and shuddering. Opened his eyes. Then I will wait, he said. But I will not pretend I am not waiting. He left, and she stood in the middle of her canvas room with her hand pressed to her sternum, feeling the wild hammering beneath, and she thought about the wolves she had heard singing on the 5th night of her fast. The minor key. The door being tested from the other side. Something was waking up inside her. Something old. Something patient. Something that had been waiting much longer than 7 days. Declan came to see her himself. He should not have been able to. Kyle's camp had perimeter security credentials chain of command, but Declan was a Beta's enforcer from an allied pack, and he had the easy confidence of a man who believes rules are for other people, and he walked into her quarters on a Tuesday afternoon while she was updating her map, and he said, "You need to come home, Ilara." She went cold, not with fear, with something older than fear. Recognition. This was the voice that had told her to hold still while his fists did their work. This was the man who had held her arms behind her back. He stood in the entrance of her quarters with his hands in his pockets and his head tilted at an angle that was almost friendly. He was tall and lean with sandy hair and a face that was handsome in a forgettable way, the kind of face that could smile at you across a room and you would smile back without thinking. He was smiling now, the same smile she remembered from the supply shed, the one that did not reach his eyes. "Pack Alpha Fenwick is concerned about you," he said. "You left without authorization. That is a violation of pack law. He is willing to overlook it if you return voluntarily." She set down her charcoal, wiped her fingers on a rag, turned to face him fully. "And the ledger?" she asked. "What ledger, Declan?" She said his name and watched something flicker behind the smile. "I am not the same woman you beat in a shed. I am under the protection of the Alpha King's War Council. Whatever Harlan told you to come here and do, think very carefully about whether it is worth the consequences." He stared at her. The smile faded slowly, like a lamp being turned down. What replaced it was not anger or menace. It was confusion, genuine confusion, as though a piece of furniture had spoken and he was trying to reconcile the familiar object with the unexpected voice. Then something else crossed his face. Brief. Barely there. A shadow that might have been regret. He looked at the bruise on her arm, the one that was almost gone now. Just a faint yellow stain on her skin, and his jaw tightened, and he looked away. I did not. He started, then stopped. His hand came out of his pocket, and he rubbed the back of his neck. It was a young gesture, uncertain. He was not much older than she was, she realized. 25, maybe. A boy playing enforcer for a corrupt beta, because that was the path that had been laid out for him. Harlan said you were stealing, Declan said quietly. He said the ledger was fabricated, that you were the one siphoning, and you were going to blame it on him. And you believed him. He looked at her. I did not ask questions. His voice had lost its smooth veneer. Underneath was something raw. I was told what to do, and I did it. That is what enforcers do. She watched him. Waited. The silence stretched. I am not going back, she said. And you should not either. What Harlan is doing will bring the Alpha King's army down on Ashvale. When it does, everyone who was part of his operation will answer for it. Every enforcer, every soldier who followed orders without asking questions. Declan stood very still. She could see him processing, the wheels turning behind the forgettable face. Then he straightened, put his hands back in his pockets, and walked out without another word. She stood in the silence he left behind, her heart hammering, and wondered if she had just made an ally or an enemy. 2 hours later, Kyle appeared at her tent. His expression was thunderous, the kind of dark rolling fury that she imagined preceded actual storms in mythology. His wolf was visible in his eyes, the amber nearly eclipsed by gold. One of the Ashvale delegates entered your quarters without authorization, he said. Declan. Yes. I handled it. Handled it. Kyle's voice was very controlled, very even. The evenness of a man who is one wrong word from shifting into something with claws. He was in your space, alone, with you, the man who put his hands on you. He came to deliver a message from his Alpha. I delivered one back. Kyle took a step closer. The tent seemed to darken around him, as though his presence consumed light. If he had touched you, he did not. If he had, Kyle's hand came up. His fingertips brushed the fading bruise on her arm so lightly, she almost didn't feel it. Almost. There would not be enough of him left to bury. The touch sent something through her like an electric current. Not pain, not pleasure. Something between. The thing in her chest roared. Actually roared a sound that she felt in her throat, even though no sound came out, a vibration that rattled her teeth and made her vision go sharp and bright and strange. Kyle felt it. She could tell by the way his eyes widened, the way his hand on her arm went from feather light to firm, gripping her, steadying her, as though she might fly apart. What was that he breathed? She shook her head. She did not know. She did not know. But that night, lying on her cot, she pressed her hand to her sternum and felt a heartbeat that was not hers. A second rhythm layered beneath her own, slower and deeper and ancient. And in the darkness of the tent, her eyes caught the lantern light and reflected it back just for a moment. Gold. The weeks passed. Ilara's intelligence work became indispensable. The map grew. The network she had uncovered stretched further than anyone had guessed, connecting not just border packs, but reaching into the northern territories, where a rogue Alpha named Volkov had been consolidating power in the vacuum left by the last territorial war. Harlan was not just stealing. He was arming an army. She presented this to the War Council with the flat affect of a woman reading a weather report. Charts, projections, supply routes marked in colored thread. The men and women around the table listened with the focused attention of wolves who have just realized the wind has shifted and the thing they thought was prey is actually a predator. "How certain are you?" Torrin asked. 93%, Elara said. "There is a 7% margin for error in the shipping manifests, because some of the coded entries use a cipher I have not fully broken. But the volume pattern is unmistakable. Volkov will have enough supplies for a 3-month offensive by the first snow." The tent was quiet. Kyle sat at the head of the table, chin resting on his fist, amber eyes fixed on the map. When he spoke, it was to Sable. "Move the eastern patrols to intercept the next shipment. I want physical evidence before we act." "And the Ashval pack?" Sable asked. Kyle looked at Elara, a long look, full of things unsaid. "Not yet," he said. "When we move on Ashvale, we move with proof no one can dispute." He paused, "and we move together." The together was weighted. Elara heard it. The whole table heard it. She met his eyes and nodded. The intimacy between them grew in stolen margins, not the grand romantic gestures of stories, smaller things, harder things. The way he began leaving a cup of broth on her desk in the mornings, placed precisely where she would find it when she reached for her charcoal. The way she began timing her walks through camp to coincide with his training sessions, standing at the edge of the practice yard, watching him spar with Torrin, while the other wolves gave her a wide berth, because the Alpha King's scent on her was unmistakable now, woven into her clothes and her hair and her skin. He never pushed. She had told him she was not ready, and he had said he would wait, and he was waiting. But the waiting had texture. It was not passive. It was a presence. He was always there, at the edge of the room, in the corner of her vision, close enough that the mate bond hummed between them like a plucked string, constant and maddening. One night, 3 weeks in, she was working late. The camp had gone quiet. The stove in her quarters was burning low, and the canvas walls breathed in and out with the wind, and her eyes were aching from hours of cross-referencing supply logs. She heard the tent flap shift, did not look up. "You should sleep," Kyle said. "So should you." He sat on the trunk by the entrance. She could hear the leather of his boots creak as he stretched his legs. He did this sometimes, came to her quarters at night, and sat and said nothing while she worked. Sometimes he brought maps of his own, and they worked in parallel, the silence between them companionable and charged at the same time. Tonight he didn't bring maps. He sat and watched her, and the weight of his gaze was something she felt on her shoulders like a hand. Elara. When was the last time someone took care of you? She stopped writing. The question landed strangely, not because it was invasive, but because she had no answer. She searched her memory for it, scanning backward through years of counting bags of grain and sleeping in supply sheds and darning her own clothes with careful stitches. Her mother had died when she was 4. Her father before that, killed in a border dispute she was too young to remember. She had been raised by the pack in the abstract sense, which meant she had been raised by no one in the concrete sense. "I take care of myself," she said. "That is not what I asked." She turned to look at him. He was leaning forward, elbows on knees in the posture that meant he was serious. His eyes were steady, patient, dangerous in their patience. She put down her charcoal. "My mother," she said, "when I was 4, she used to rub my feet when they were cold. I remember the feeling, but not her face." She paused. "No one since." Kyle was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and crossed the space and knelt in front of her chair. The Alpha King of the Eastern Territories, feared by 40,000 wolves, knelt on the canvas floor of a record storage room and took her right foot in his hands. His hands were rough, calloused from sword hilts and bridle reins and whatever else kings hold. But they were warm, that impossible warmth, and they held her foot with a gentleness that did not match the rest of him. And he pressed his thumb into the arch, and the pressure released something in her that she had been holding for 19 years. She cried. Silently. The tears just fell, tracking down her cheeks and dripping onto her shirt, and she did not wipe them away, because her hands were shaking, and she was afraid that if she moved, she would shatter the moment, and he would stop, and she would have to go back to being the woman who took care of herself, because no one else would. He did not stop. He pressed and kneaded, and the warmth of his hands soaked into her bones, and she cried, and he looked up at her with those amber eyes, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. They both knew what this was. The next morning, the Ashvale delegates formally demanded Elara's return. The demand came through official channels this time, a sealed letter bearing Fenwick's mark delivered by a rider who waited at the perimeter for a response. The language was diplomatic. The subtext was not. Elara is pack property. She left without authorization. Return her or face a charge of pack member abduction before the Territorial Council. Kyle read the letter at the War Council table. His expression did not change. When he finished, he folded it, once set it down and looked at Elara. They are escalating, she said, which means Harlan is nervous. If I have the ledger, he needs me discredited or disappeared before the evidence becomes actionable. Do they know you have presented your findings to my council? Sable asked. Probably not. But they know I have the ledger, and they know I am here. The logical next step is to claim legal authority to retrieve me before I can share what I know. Kyle tapped his index finger on the folded letter. Once. Twice. I will deny the request, he said, on grounds of wartime intelligence privilege. Fenwick can take it to the Territorial Council if he wants, but it will take months, and by then we will have Volkov's supply chain dismantled. And if they do not wait for the council, Torren asked, then they will learn why I am called king, and they are called Border Pack. The words were cold, factual. Elara felt the shiver run through the room. Not fear. Recognition. They were sitting in the presence of a man who could back up every syllable. But Harlan didn't wait for councils or formal responses. The attack came at night. A foggy, moonless night when the camp's perimeter vision was at its weakest. Elara woke to the sound of canvas tearing and a hand clamping over her mouth. The hand smelled of pine pitch and something sour. Ashvale, she thrashed. The grip tightened. A voice hissed in her ear. Do not scream. Do not shift. You are coming home. She bit the hand. Hard. Tasted blood. The grip loosened for 1 second, and she screamed a raw sound that tore out of her throat and reverberated through the camp, and in the same instant, the thing in her chest, the thing that had been stirring and slamming and howling for weeks, erupted. It was not a shift. Not exactly. She did not sprout fur or grow claws, but something poured out of her, a wave of energy that was light and heat and sound all at once, and the man holding her was thrown backward as though struck by a wall of compressed air. He hit the tent pole, and the canvas collapsed around them both, and she was standing in the wreckage, breathing hard, her eyes blazing gold in the darkness. 2 more Ashvale wolves rushed in from the torn side of the tent. They were in half-shift faces, elongated claws extended. She raised her hands, and did not think, just acted on an instinct so deep it predated thought. The energy came again, pulsing from her palms in concentric rings that she could see, actually see, glowing white gold in the dark. The wolves staggered. One dropped to his knees, clutching his head. Then Kyle was there. He came through the collapsed canvas like a force of nature already in full shift. His wolf was enormous, black-furred with amber eyes that burned in the darkness like forge fires. He hit the nearest Ashvale wolf with the full weight of his body, and the sound was bone meeting earth, a crunch that she felt in her own teeth. It was over in seconds. 3 Ashvale wolves on the ground, one unconscious, one whimpering, one very still. Kyle's wolf stood over them, sides, heaving, muzzle dark with blood. Then he shifted, standing upright, naked, breathing hard, the blood still on his face. He looked at her hands, which were still glowing faintly, the white gold light fading like embers. "Elara," he said. His voice was rough, wrecked. "What are you?" She looked at her hands. The light guttered and went out, leaving after-images on her retinas. She was shaking. Not from fear. From the absence of the energy that had just passed through her, leaving her hollow and buzzing and somehow more alive than she had ever felt. "I do not know," she whispered, but that was not entirely true. She had felt it. In the moment the power surged, she had felt her wolf. Not dormant, not dead. Present. Vast. So vast that the word wolf was inadequate. It was not a wolf. It was the memory of wolves. The first wolf. Something primordial and immense that had been sleeping inside her for 23 years waiting, and the attack had cracked the seal. The camp doctor arrived within minutes. He was the same lean grey wolf who had told her to leave on day 4 of her fast. He looked at the fallen Ashvale wolves, at the collapsed tent, at Elara, standing in the wreckage, with her hands trembling, and her eyes still carrying the ghost of gold. He adjusted his spectacles and said, "Ah." That explains the blood eclipse. They moved to Kyle's tent. The war council assembled. Torren and Sable and the commanders all pulled from sleep, all carrying weapons, all bristling with the barely contained energy of wolves who had been woken by a threat to their camp. Elara sat at the table. Kyle sat beside her. Not across from her. Beside her. Close enough that their arms touched, and the contact sent a steady pulse of warmth through the mate bond that kept her from shaking apart. The camp doctor, whose name was Aldrich, stood at the head of the table and spoke with the measured cadence of a man delivering a diagnosis he has suspected for a long time. The blood eclipse, he said, occurs once every 300 years. The last recorded instance was before the Great Pack Formation. Legend holds that wolves born under the blood eclipse carry the essence of the progenitor. The first wolf. The one from which all bloodlines descend. He looked at Elara. The power presents as energy manipulation, force projection. In historical records it was called the White Fire, and it only fully awakens under extreme duress, a trigger, usually tied to the mate bond. The table was silent. "You are saying," Sable said slowly, "that the ration clerk from a border pack is carrying the bloodline of the first wolf." Aldrich adjusted his spectacles again. "I am saying her power woke up when the Alpha King's mate bond was threatened. I am saying she threw 3 wolves across a tent without shifting. I am saying her eyes turned gold. You may draw your own conclusions." Kyle's hand found Elara's beneath the table. His fingers laced through hers and held, not possessively, protectively, like holding something that has been proven rare and does not yet know its own value. "This changes the tactical picture," Torren said. "If Harlan learns what she is." "He will not," Kyle said. He already suspects, Ilara said. Everyone turned to look at her. She squeezed Cale's hand and drew a breath. Fenwick tested me when I was 13. The healer said dormant, but Fenwick. He looked relieved. Not disappointed. Relieved. A wolfless Omega is harmless. A Blood Eclipse wolf in a border pack is a political earthquake. She paused. He knew what I was. He suppressed the information. And when I found out about Harlan's theft and threatened to expose it, they did not just beat me to silence a whistleblower. They beat me to keep me from ever discovering what was inside me. The silence that followed was the dense, weighted kind. The kind that fills a room before decisions are made that cannot be unmade. Kyle spoke. His voice was very quiet. We move on Ashvale tomorrow. Ilara shook her head. No. We move on Volkov. Ashvale is a symptom. Volkov is the disease. If we take Ashvale now, Volkov loses a supply line, but gains a rallying cry. A border pack attacked by the Alpha King. He will use it to turn every neutral pack against you. We take Volkov Sable finished following the logic, and Ashvale's supply pipeline collapses. Harlan has nothing to sell nothing, to leverage no external support. He becomes a corrupt beta in a weakened pack with no allies. Ilara nodded. And then you take Ashval, not with an army, with evidence. My ledger, the intercepted shipments, presented to the Territorial Council with full documentation. Legal. Clean. Unimpeachable. Kyle looked at her. The amber eyes were bright. Not with his wolf, with something else. Admiration. Recognition. The look of a king who has found not just a mate, but an equal. When this is over, he said, you are never going back to counting bags of flour. She almost smiled. I was very good at counting bags of flour. He squeezed her hand. You are very good at everything, he said. It is extremely annoying. This time she did smile, and the tension in the room cracked just slightly. And Torren laughed his low, rumbling laugh, and Sable spun a throwing knife between her fingers with the casual grace of a woman who was already planning the operation in her head. The campaign against Volkov took 3 weeks. Ilara stayed at the base camp. This was not negotiable, though she argued. Kyle had looked at her with an expression that was both tender and immovable, and said, My wolf will not function if you are in the field. I will be distracted. I will make errors. I will get my soldiers killed because half of my mind will be tracking your heartbeat instead of tracking the enemy. You are my greatest strength and my greatest vulnerability, and I need you where I know you are safe. She had hated it. Hated the waiting, hated the impotence, hated pacing the perimeter of the base camp while reports came in, fragmentary and delayed. But she used the time. She broke Harlan's cipher the last 7% of uncertainty in her analysis, and what she found was worse than she had projected. Volkov was not just building a supply cache. He was building alliances. 5 border packs. 2 of them packs that were nominally loyal to Kyle's territory. The offensive was not 3 months away. It was 3 weeks. She sent a runner to the front with the intelligence. Fastest wolf in the camp, a young female named Petra, with legs like a whippet, who covered 40 miles in a night. The response came back the next morning, in Kyle's hand. 2 words on a scrap of paper written in charcoal so hard it had torn the fiber. I know. Then a second line lighter, almost gentle. I am coming back to you. She held the paper and pressed it to her lips, and the thing in her chest, the wolf the first, wolf the white fire, whatever it was, sang. Kyle returned in 12 days. Not 3 weeks. 12 days. He had adapted the campaign based on her intelligence, hitting Volkov's supply lines, first cutting the rogue Alpha off from his newly allied packs before the alliances could solidify. It was surgical. Precise. the kind of warfare that textbooks would later call innovative, and that Elara would privately call obvious once you read the logistics correctly. Volkov himself was captured on the 11th day. Not killed. Captured. This surprised Elara. She had expected a body. What she got was a prisoner in chains, a lean, grey-eyed wolf with a face like a knife and a silence that unnerved even Torren. Kyle returned to camp on the 12th day, riding at the head of his column, with the afternoon sun catching the blood still dried in his hair. He dismounted and walked through the camp, and he did not go to the war tent. He did not go to the command post. He walked straight to her quarters and pulled back the tent flap and stood there, smelling of blood and sweat and exhaustion, and looked at her. She looked back, at the new cut along his jaw, at the way he held his left shoulder, carefully protecting a wound beneath the armor, at the amber eyes that were burning with something so raw and desperate that she felt it in her own body, a sympathetic ache, the mate bond, translating his need into her nerve endings. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." She crossed the space between them. It was not a large space, but it felt enormous each step, a decision each step, a letting go. She reached him and put her hands on his chest and felt the heartbeat there, strong and rapid and matching the second rhythm that had lived beneath her own for weeks now. "I lied to you," she said, "when I said I was not ready." His hands came up. They cupped her face, the rough palms against her cheeks, the warmth pouring through. His thumbs traced her cheekbones, and she felt him shaking. The Alpha King of the Eastern Territories was trembling against her palms. "I know," he said. She rose on her toes and pressed her forehead to his, and breathed him in. Cedar, smoke, dark honey, blood, exhaustion, home. "I am ready," she said. He kissed her. Not gently, not carefully. He kissed her the way a drowning man breathes when he surfaces. All of him. The king and the wolf, and the man, and the war, and the waiting, all of it, poured into the press of his mouth against hers, and she opened to it, let it fill her, and the white fire rose in her chest and flowed through the bond between them, and she felt his wolf howl inside him, felt it answer her own two sounds, becoming one, a harmony so complete it seemed to restructure the air around them. When they pulled apart, his eyes were fully golden. Not amber. Gold. His wolf looking out at her, wolf looking out at him. "Mine," he said. Not a claim. A prayer. "Yours," she answered. Not a surrender. A choice. There was still Asheville. The confrontation came a week later. Kyle brought a delegation to the Asheville packhouse, and Elara rode beside him, not behind. She wore the leather vest and the wool trousers and her mother's wooden hair clasp, and she carried the ledger in a satchel across her chest like a soldier carries a weapon. The Asheville packhouse was as she remembered it. A sprawling timber building that smelled of pine resin and coal smoke, and the particular mustiness of too many wolves living too close together. The porch creaked under their boots. The front hall was lined with mounted antlers that cast jagged shadows in the weak light. Fenwick met them in the great room. He looked smaller than she remembered. Older. His rheumy eyes moved from Kale to Elara to the contingent of royal wolves behind them, and she watched him calculate, assess. The mind behind the weak exterior was not weak at all. It was the mind of a survivor, a man who had held a border pack together for 30 years by knowing exactly when to yield and when to resist. He chose to yield. "Alpha King," he said. "A small bow." "We are honored." "Spare me," Kyle said. "Where is your beta?" Fenwick's eyes flickered. "Harlan is attending to pack business." Kyle looked at Torren. Torren nodded, and left with 4 wolves. The sound of their boots receded down the corridor. Elara stepped forward. She opened the satchel and placed the ledger on the table between them. Beside it, she placed the decoded shipping manifests that Sable's scouts had intercepted. Beside those, the supply audit that mapped every diverted shipment, every coded transaction, every connection between Ashvile's stores and Volkov's now dismantled army. Fenwick looked at the documents. He did not touch them. He looked at them the way a man looks at a trap. "You knew," Elara said. Not accusing, stating. "You knew what Harlan was doing. You knew what I was. You let him beat me because it solved 2 problems at once. Silence the whistleblower. Keep the Blood Eclipse wolf dormant." Fenwick was quiet for a long time. The great room ticked with the sound of an old clock on the mantel, a mechanical thing with a brass pendulum that Elara remembered from childhood. She used to watch it swing when she had nothing else to do. Back, forth, back, forth. Counting time in a place that never changed. "I held this pack together," Fenwick said. His voice was thin, reedy. An old man's voice, but there was iron underneath. "For 30 years, through 2 wars and a famine, and 3 challenges from wolves who wanted to tear it apart. Every decision I made was to keep us alive." He looked at Elara, and his eyes were not the eyes of a villain. They were the eyes of a man who had made too many pragmatic choices and lost the ability to distinguish pragmatism from cruelty. "You were not a person to me, Elara. You were a variable, a risk, and I managed you the way I managed every risk. By containing it." She stared at him. The honesty of it was more disturbing than cruelty would have been. He was not apologizing. He was not justifying. He was explaining the logic of his arithmetic. She had been a number in his ledger, a liability to be minimized, and the beating she asked. Fenwick's mouth thinned. "That was Harlan, not my order, but not prevented." "No." He met her eyes. "Not prevented." The silence held. The clock ticked. Then Torren returned, pushing Harlan ahead of him. The Beta was a large man, broad-shouldered, with the blunt features and thick neck of a wolf who relied on physical intimidation. His wrists were bound behind his back with chain. He was not resisting. He was scanning the room, calculating the way a cornered animal looks for exits. His eyes found Elara and stopped. She watched something move through his expression. Not fear. Not yet. Surprise, mostly. That the ration clerk he had treated as disposable was standing in his great room next to the Alpha King wearing authority-like armor, holding the documentation of his crimes. Beta Harlan of Ashvel Kyle said. His voice filled the room, the way smoke fills a jar, complete and inescapable. "You are charged with theft of pack resources, conspiracy with a hostile territory, and assault on a pack member under your authority. The evidence is documented and verified. You have the right to contest these charges before the Territorial Council. Do you wish to contest?" Harlan looked at the ledger, at the manifests, at the supply audit. Then he looked at Fenwick, and Elara saw it. The moment of realization. The old Alpha had not protected him, had never intended to protect him, had yielded because yielding to the Alpha King was the pragmatic move, and Harlan, for all his cunning, had always been the expendable variable. The risk to be managed. Just like Elara. "No," Harlan said. His voice was flat, defeated. "I do not contest." Kyle nodded. "You will be held for trial. Your assets are forfeit. Your rank is stripped." He paused. "And if you ever raise your hand to an Omega again in any pack under any authority, I will not wait for a trial." Harlan said nothing. Torren led him away. In the corridor as they walked out, Elara passed Declan. He was standing against the wall with his arms at his sides, and his face carefully blank. She stopped. He looked at her. The forgettable face, the sandy hair, the young man who had held her arms and followed orders and carried the weight of both. "I could have refused," he said quietly. She almost did not hear him over the sound of boots and chains ahead. "I want you to know that I know that." She nodded. "I know you know." A pause. Then he said, "What happens to enforcers? That depends," she said, "on what they do next." She walked on. She did not look back, but she heard him exhale a long, slow breath, the sound of a man deciding something. The claiming ceremony took place at the Alpha King's camp, not the Ashvale pack house. This was deliberate. Chaol wanted it on his ground, in his territory, witnessed by his wolves. It was political, but it was also personal. He wanted to claim his mate in the place where she had knelt in the mud for 7 days, because he was the kind of man who understood the power of transformation, of returning to the site of suffering and rewriting its meaning. The camp had been transformed. Torches lined the main thoroughfare. The war tent had been opened, its canvas walls pulled back to create an amphitheater of sorts, and the clearing in front of it was packed with wolves. Hundreds of them, Chaol's army, his council, his pack. And in the front row, the washerwoman, with red knuckles, who had left a tin cup of water for a stranger. Elara had asked for her specifically. Elara stood at the edge of the clearing in the twilight, and the dress she wore was not white. It was deep green, the color of forest floors, simple and well-made, with a neckline that left her shoulders and the column of her throat bare. Her hair was down for the first time in weeks, falling past her shoulders, and the wooden clasp her mother had given her was pinned above her heart. Chaol waited at the center of the clearing. He wore black. No armor, no weapons, just a man. The largest man in a camp of large men, scarred and dark-haired and amber-eyed, standing in the torchlight with an expression that Elara would carry in her memory for the rest of her life. Not the expression of a king, not the expression of an alpha, the expression of a man who has been looking for something he was not sure existed, and has found it kneeling in the mud outside his tent, holding a ledger. She walked to him. Her feet were bare. She felt the grass beneath them, cool and damp with evening dew, and then the packed earth of the clearing, gritty and warm from the torchlight. She felt every step. She wanted to feel every step. After 23 years of moving through the world without leaving a mark, she wanted to feel the ground beneath her, and know that she was here, present, visible, chosen. She reached him. He took her hands. His were shaking again. The Alpha King, feared by nations, trembling. He did not speak vows. There were no vows in a mate bond ceremony. The bond was older than language, older than ritual, older than the packs themselves. What he did was lean down and press his forehead to hers and breathe. She breathed with him, in and out, their heartbeats synchronized, 2 rhythms becoming one. And then, the thing in her chest, her wolf the first. Wolf the white fire rose. It came up through her like dawn, slow, inevitable. She felt it in her feet first, a warmth that spread upward through her legs, her hips, her ribs, her chest, her throat. It poured out of her skin in a soft white gold light that illuminated the clearing like a second sun. She heard the gasps of the watching wolves, felt their attention like a physical weight. But she kept her eyes on Chaol. He opened his mouth against her throat. She felt his teeth, not biting, resting, asking. Yes, she said. He bit. Not hard enough to damage, hard enough to mark. She felt it like a key, turning in a lock, a final mechanism engaging, and the mate bond crystallized between them in a rush of sensation so intense she lost her vision for a moment. The world went white, gold. She heard his wolf howl. She heard her own answer. Two voices. One sound. The mark sealed, warm, permanent. A point of connection on her throat that she would carry for the rest of her life. He pulled back and looked at her, and his eyes were gold, and hers were gold, and for a moment they were not two people standing in a torchlit clearing. They were something older, something that remembered the first wolves, and the first bond, and the reason it existed in the first place. Not possession, not even love, though love was there. Recognition, the bone-deep certainty of having found the other half of a pattern that was not complete alone. The pack howled. Hundreds of voices raised in unison, a sound that shook the ground and vibrated in Ilara's chest and rolled across the camp and out into the borderlands where other packs would hear it and know. The Alpha King had claimed his Luna, and she had claimed him. The weeks that followed were not easy. Ilara had never expected them to be. Volkov sat in chains and negotiated. Ashvale reorganized under new leadership. 3 border packs that had been allied with Volkov petitioned for amnesty. The Territorial Council convened. Ilara sat on Kael's War Council as his official intelligence analyst. And she worked, and she strategized, and she argued with Torin about supply logistics, and she threw knives with Sable in the practice yard, and she was for the first time in her life part of something. Not tolerated. Part of. One evening, 6 weeks after the claiming, she walked through the camp at dusk and passed the spot where she had knelt. The mud was gone. The camp thoroughfare had been graded and gravelled during the reorganization, but she stopped and stood there anyway, looking at the ground that had held her weight for 7 days. The young guard, the one with the ghost of acne scars, was on perimeter duty. He saw her standing there and approached, uncertain. "Luna," he said. The title still felt new. Strange, like a coat that did not quite fit her shoulders. "Is everything all right?" She looked at him. "What is your name?" "Thomas Luna." "Thomas." She nodded. "Were you here when I arrived? 7 days kneeling in the mud?" He flushed. The scars along his jaw stood out against the reddening skin. Yes, Luna. I was." She was quiet for a moment. "Then, did you ever think about bringing me water?" He swallowed. "Every day," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I wanted to. But the sergeant said." "A woman with red knuckles brought me water on day 2, Ilara said. She was not a soldier. She was not under any obligation. She just saw someone who was thirsty." Thomas looked at the ground. His throat worked. "You do not need permission to be kind, Thomas," Ilara said. "Remember that. It is the only order I will ever give you." She walked away. Behind her, she heard him exhale, the way Declan had exhaled in the Ashvale corridor, the sound of something beginning. She found Kael in the war tent, hunched over maps by lantern light, the shadows carving his face into planes of gold and dark. He looked up when she entered, and his expression shifted the way it always did, from whatever he was to whatever she made him. Softer. Younger. The scar on his temple catching the light. She crossed to him and kissed the top of his head, breathing in the cedar, and the smoke, and the particular warmth that she now recognized as home. And she placed her hand on the back of his neck, and felt the mate bond hum between them steady and alive. He pulled her into his lap, wrapped his arms around her, pressed his face into the curve of her throat, where the mark lived and breathed. She held him. The Alpha King. the most powerful wolf on the continent, shaking in her arms like a man who still cannot believe his luck. Outside the camp settled into evening. Cookfires sparked, sentries called the watch. Somewhere in the distance, wild wolves sang in a minor key, and this time deep in Ilara's chest her wolf sang back. Not a howl, not the white fire. Something quieter, something that sounded, if you listened closely, like a woman humming a hymn about mercy, but meaning it.